Still talking about mean histogram standard deviation. There's this really cool measure called the coefficient of variation. Let's look at an example. Here we have our yaks that we've been using for the previous two videos. Right, we have our mean for our yaks. Right, we have our sample standard deviation. That's what we did in the last two videos. Right, if we change the question, say which is more consistent in its cheese production, yaks or goats? Well, we of course would have to get a nice sample of goats and track them, measure. I'm not even going to show the data, but the results is that the sample standard deviation for that sample of goats, however many there were, is 10.4 kilograms. You can see that 10.4 is less than 19.27, which on the surface would make you think, oh, well, less, smaller sample standard deviation means less variation, which is another way of saying more consistent. Right? So here the goats appear to be more consistent, right? And the yaks have greater variation. But, goats are so much smaller than yaks. Yaks are big. Goats, not so much. So is this a legitimate straight comparison? Well, if we look at the mean of the number of kgs of cheese that goats make, well, it's much smaller than 37.81. So really, does this represent less variation than yaks? And this is the question that coefficient variation answers. So really, what it does is it takes the measure of spread or variation at 19.27 and says, well, what's that as a ratio of its own mean, right? Essentially, what percentage of its own mean is its measure of spread? So we have 51%. If we do the same thing with the goats, so in comparison to its own mean, we have a coefficient of variation of 0.66 or 66%, where here the coefficient of variation is 0.51 or 51%. And really what that means is that because the 66 is greater than the 51, the goats appear to have actually a greater variation in cheese as compared to their own mean, right? Which, because there's such a large difference between the size of a goat and a yak, is a better comparison. So the goats have greater variation. The yaks are more consistent. Right? So where before, if you just looked at the sample standard deviations, you might conclude that the goats were more consistent. Really, by looking at the coefficient of variation, you see that it's the yaks that are in fact more consistent. And you use this coefficient of variation again when the data is from two very different kinds of anything, in this case animals. But if there's a great difference in scale of the means, then you might want to use the coefficient of variation.